Obrigado. Thank you very, very much. I would like to thank all of you for taking a moment of your time to listen to me this afternoon. I would especially like all of those people associated and affiliated with IEAT for the very kind invitation for me to spend some time, some considerable time here at the UFMG to contemplate our work and to, in fact, I'm finding it quite invigorating for our work. I must thank my two colleagues, the Eduardo Neto and Eduardo Vargas, who have been very, very, very kind and very supportive in making this entire thing happen, and I really appreciate that. I'm finding it to be a very invigorating opportunity for me to both present my ideas and to develop them. Paula, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak here in this faculty, and all of that she's done to help me adjust and to settle here. And Professor Van Claire, thank you very much for your collegial welcome to the city of Horizonte and to your UFMG. And Mauricio is a real cool guy. I had a wonderful lunch with him, and he promised to take me to listen to some unique form of Brazilian jazz. And that's going to Sure. So he makes a lot of claims about it. I haven't heard much of it, and I'm going to see if he's right. There will be alcohol drunk, I understand, so that might help with convincing me of the power of his music. But I want to thank you and your staff and everyone affiliated with bringing me here. I always feel a strong connection to UFMG because, in fact, my contact with the university began long before I arrived here by sending students to study with us at the University of Pennsylvania, of which one has returned. Casio was sitting there. He was a brilliant student there, and I had an opportunity to work with him and to engage with him in some of the projects that we have initiated at the University of Pennsylvania. So thank you very much for your welcome. I would like to talk to you about the first slide. I would like to talk to you about a project that I have been engaged in. And so at first I would like to take an opportunity to ask us to consider the impact of the tradition of critical theories of race in the social science and how these traditions might help us understand societies heavily impacted by Africa and the African diaspora, and to consider how we might reconsider what it means to be a human being. I hope to discuss with you over the series of these lectures why this need to re-examine what we mean by a human being is so necessary, why it is so important that this reconsideration will offer us a better vantage point to do what we do as human beings, to live the lives that we live, and to address problems of inequality, social injustice, and to advance the hope and potential of the millions of people on planet Earth who are denied those opportunities because of lines of difference that we have created. My project deals with Africa and the African diaspora, and therefore it has been heavily influenced, and my own thought and my own existence has been heavily influenced by the national liberation movements to decolonize Africa, Asia, and parts of Latin America. the civil rights movements to deracialize civil society in Europe, North America, South America, and the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. All of these movements question the Eurocentric division of humanity. All of these traditions question the Eurocentric divisions of humanity. And it is important to recognize these divisions as being essential in every society in planet Earth at this moment. In this seminar, I hope to, with you, to think about how do we question the racialization of our identity in society. I am not accustomed to just granting that race exists. I suggest that a critical interpretation of its existence is necessary. It is not, in my view, simply a question of racial identity, but a question of the impact of installing racial identities on people and what this has done to us. The next slide, please. So I initiated a project to do and write a book on the demography of Africa and the African diaspora in around 1998. And I instantly was confronted with a fundamental problem in the academy. And that is, how do we define Africa? How do we define the African diaspora? And as I began a process of trying to define them in order to write my book, I was derailed and ended up writing another book. I was derailed because I found it very problematic the way we defined Africa and the way we defined the African diaspora. I found it very problematic in how I was engaging intellectually with what we thought was the African diaspora. So that resulted in a book. And that book, which is called Thicker Than Blood, was, I think, the first book in this project. It was recently translated into Spanish, in case you want to read it in Spanish. And I will give 2 copies of these for the library here, so you can take a look at them. And this initiated a conversation that I engaged in the academy around what is race and how do we study race and what is it about. So in the initial phase of the project, then I have come to a point where rather than just focusing on Africa and the African diaspora, I've had to ask the question of what is it to be a human being? Who is a human being? And what kind of human beings are we? And are we in fact different because of what society has labeled us and the labels that we have embraced? This then is this initial part of this project, a little longer than I anticipated. So 16 years later, I am now at the point of talking about Africa and the African diaspora. But along the way, we wrote several other volumes to address the various questions that have to do with what is race, what does it mean to be from Africa, and how do we deal with these questions when the scholars who ask them are themselves influenced by how they will answer the question. So it's, and I always want to be in the position of respecting the potential for objectivity among scholars. However, I also would find it very strange if a Martian came down and started trying to tell human beings about how they could be better human beings. Because a Martian would not have the ability to empathize with humanity. the Martian, I would beg to think, would not appreciate fully the societal context in which humans operate. Therefore, the objectivity that we have when we engage in the study of society is already influenced by our very existence in society. We are given many ideas about almost every question we pose, and those ideas influence our objectivity and indeed influence what we think is possible to understand. I don't know. Do I turn this on? Is it not on? How about that? Is that better? All right. I hope you got some of what I said before. I'm not going to repeat all of it. And so, one volume, we engaged many students and professors around these questions, and from that we produced an edited volume called White Logic, White Method, in which we again questioned some of these very same questions. And I think it's at that point that I then began to work on two simultaneous projects on Africa. One which looked at pre-colonial Africa, and one which looked at African independence. I finished writing the book on Timbuktu, which is the one on pre-colonial Africa, way before I started working on the book on African independence. However, as it turned out, there was a war that interrupted our work in Mali, and so we completed the film and the book on African independence, and held a conference in which people commented on the film and the idea of the film, and put together a short volume, and that volume is out, which is called Perspectives on Africa and the World. And African Independence is being published along with the book Timbuktu, and they should be out within a few months. The project now that we are engaged in is a work which I cannot imagine. I conceive it actually as more than one volume, and the project is on Africa and the African diaspora. Our own contribution in this way comes in two forms. Because of my experience in film and television, all of my books have an accompanying film. And so we've been working on doing films as we write, as we do the research. So that the current project, which focuses on Latin America, has the objective of producing two films and two books which focus on the Afro-descendant population in Latin America, especially looking at 5 countries: Peru, Ecuador, Venezuela, Colombia, and Brazil. So those are the parameters of the project. And the project probably, I hope it doesn't take me another 16 years to get the other volumes out. I have other interests as well. However, these projects tend to define themselves on the basis of what you learn by engaging in the research itself. Today, what I would like to do is to talk about race, and I would like to kind of put my comments around a few very clear and simple questions. The first question is, does race exist? And this is a very important question to ask. It's a very important question to ask because in reality, one could say that race is a result of our biological status. Something about us makes us a particular race. It could be our skin color. It could be the texture of our hair. People have used these things in order to make systems of racial classification. The wax in our ear, the way snot comes out of our nose, the way we smell, all of these things have been used as ways of establishing the lines of what race is about. But most of these are kind of natural biological myths. They are myths that have been perpetuated by us naturalizing and saying that they are real without any real evidence about their reality. This position is juxtaposed very strongly to an idea of race being socially in existence. And social existence shouldn't be scoffed at because we are dependent on social existence every day. If you ever have an opportunity to go to a bank, you have engaged a social institution. Its legitimacy and its basis is created by society, which necessitates its use. But it is a socially created institution all the same. Nothing confirms this more than the internet, which has taken over many of the things which used to happen at the bank that now you don't even need a bank in order to do them. But what it does require is social confidence in the bank and in the existence of the bank and in the solvency of the bank. When that goes away, there's a run on the bank, there's a challenge to the legitimacy of the bank, and in fact the banks themselves may change and the rules for their existence may change. So too, it is argued by some, is the notion of race. That race has a social political existence, and that social political existence cannot be ignored. That you can ignore it, you can act as if it doesn't exist, but you do that within the context of supporting the most powerful racial grouping within the society. So not appreciating the significance of race is to confound it with other things which are influenced by race. So that race is, at least everywhere that I see it, always tied into social and economic status. Now, I want to suggest to you that race is not what we see. It is not. In many places in the world, they have an idea that people are black and that other people are white. And I have traveled around a lot of the world, and indeed I have seen a few people who are white. Not many, but a few people who are white. And the weather is typically cold because if you take them out of that very cold setting, they start getting a little red. So the fact of their whiteness is an artifact of both the environment that they're in and the desire for my eyes to see something that is white. The idea of seeing someone who is black is something that I have also seen. I have seen some people who are so black that you might call them blue, or you might call them purple. And their black is a beautiful black, it might be said. But that is rare, still, again. But most of the people who think they are white, who think they are brown, who think they are black, who think they are something in between, who think they are white, they are indeed not those colors. Their racial identification is not simply a result of what they see. It is not simply a result of what you see. It is a result of the context in which you see them. I love this picture, which is an old picture from a photographer named Bandasi, who is known as the photographer of the Harlem Renaissance. And this is a photo of the mulatto woman. And part of it is that the fire from the fireplace just lights her body up beautifully. She sits on this tapestry, and the stairs there in the background all present, a particular scene kind of exotic way of looking upon her nude body. And I like the film, though, the photo, though, because of its illusion. There is no fire, there is no stairway, and the tapestry that she is sitting on is not really original tapestry, but some that the photographer used, all in order to generate a particular image for you to see, for us, the viewers, to see, about what a mulatto should look like. So he played with the light on her skin. And by playing with the light on her skin, he gave us something to see. And these images of race, these kind of iconic representations of whiteness, these iconic representations of mixedness or mulatto-ness, require an acceptance of an illogical way of thinking about color. Because if you really think about it, if you had a white person and they did it sexually with a black person, what they should produce is a gray person. That's what they should produce. But we don't have to think about that because we're being taught to think illogically about the reality of what race is, and we allow our eyes to lie to us. So that if someone asks us about our own race, we have an answer, even if it's to argue with the idea of race. But the very notion of mixedness of race requires an acceptance of the polar realities of race. And these polar realities of race create an illusion which we must collectively embrace in our own way of establishing the insanity of practicing life in a racial society. Now, race in the past gave us certain images, and I just want to just read these as we get them. And these are images which you may or may not have seen, and they are famous in one way or another for somebody. Just keep going through them, and you'll see some. So, these historical representations of what it is to be white and what it is to be black and what race means has led to great human tragedy and human degradation. It hasn't stopped. If you look at some of the more vivid images of race today, and you will find that it is constantly about a kind of confrontation with people. So race doesn't work because of our individual experience. Race works because of the societies that we live in, and they necessitate the existence of race for certain social purposes. Let me dwell on the lack of race as a biological thing. Let me just, I want to the next slide, please. I want to right, thank you. I want to argue that, and I've argued in my work, that racial lines and categories are artificially drawn by human beings. That's why we don't have gray people, but we have white and black people. And we have white and black people all over the place, but no gray people. And nobody even claiming that we could produce gray people. So human beings draw these lines in order to create systems. And so if we see race, as I am suggesting, as a hierarchical system of human relations, it is a system arranged in order of rank, in order of a hierarchy. So that is what race is about. I would like to suggest to you that there is no way for race to exist in a neutral space, because they don't exist like that. Race is created as an antagonistic social process, and as such, necessitates a particular ordering of people. So I'm suggesting to you that rather than look at race as something that you are, look at race as something that we are in. Because no race exists by itself. It doesn't even make sense. One race needs another race in order to validate its existence. Therefore, it becomes extremely important to understand how the system of race is initiated, who it benefits, and why they would need such a system. And I'm suggesting to you as well that you need to understand these things before you can study race. Because if you don't understand these things, you can't study race. And in fact, you will study race as if you don't need those things, and those things will determine how you study race. Because they will already give you a reality of what is white, what is black, and you will know it based on your experience. You will know it based on what your parents told you. You will know it based on what you talk to with your friends as you're sitting down listening to some Brazilian jazz, drinking some cervezas, or something like that. Given this, all race occurs within a national context. It occurs within different nations, and it has a specificity which is related to that particular national context. I believe it would be a mistake to consider race to be the same in Colombia, and the same in Brazil, and the same in South Africa, and the same in Britain. And the reason that I would say that is because each of those countries has a national context which has put a stamp on what it means to be a citizen in that particular country, what it means to be a person, to be part of the people, to be a full citizen, not a second-class citizen within those particular countries. So for me, race is socially and historically specific. It is very difficult to even label race today in the same way that race was yesterday. So that race in the 19th century is not the same as race in the 21st century. There are differences. And I want to talk about some of those differences, but I think that recognizing these differences will help us appreciate the work that race does in modern society. The next slide. So there is a biological myth of race. And we have tended to view race as part of our biological makeup. That's how we have these ideas about racial mixture and racial mixing. And we have regulations, and we have scientific studies, and we have people investigating what this racial mixture produces and what it means. I believe race is far more complex than our biological makeup. Race is about a lot more than the blood that flows in our veins. There was a time, and this was a long time ago, and actually science is not even looking at mixture in these ways anymore. But there was a time when it was believed that blood and the purity of blood was the major way of understanding an individual's character. If they were of an upstanding and outstanding character, it was because they had good heritage. And this good heritage was reflected in their blood. And so you shouldn't mix good blood with bad blood. You shouldn't mix white blood with black blood. You shouldn't mix European blood with indigenous blood. that these ideas of mixture always had within them a certain notion of creating something different. Whether that different was an elevation for some engaged in the mixture or a degradation for others engaged in the mixture is the acceptance of the idea of mixture itself and what that mixture would mean among human beings. And if you bring a human being who is classified as white and a human being who is classified as black, and they go together and they make another human being, what is the human being? How different has this mixture of the blood created something that is not a black human being or a white human being, a European human being or an African human being? So race is, I'm suggesting to you, not about shared subjective characteristics like blood, like your genetic constitution, like the color of your skin, like the texture of your hair, like the oil in your ear, like the veins or the blood in your veins or the allia in your genes. Blood is not about those shared characteristics. Because in fact, if you take any racial group that's constituted anywhere in the world, there is more variation within that racial group than there is variation among two different racial groups. So there's more difference within racial groups than there is difference among racial groups. And that is important for understanding because it is part of the way that you can never really substantiate establishing a biological model, a scientific model for racial identity. The biological myth of race has its origin in evolutionary theory, that's for sure. Because in the 19th century, there was a desire to explain, to define racial differences with the latest ideas. When the latest ideas were religion, it was because God deemed certain races inferior and others superior. When it was the era of science, it was because of some particular measurable thing in those who were inferior and those who were superior that defined what race was about. The evolutionary theory from pre-Darwinian theory all the way to the eugenics, ideas of evolutionary development of human beings in the earliest 20th century, giving rise to the racial science that would become one of the backbones of the Nazi myths, all helped legitimate the biological basis of racial classifications that existed in the 19th and the 20th century. One of the first people to come up with a system of race, and we still use their work, Linnaeus and Blumenbach are two of the individuals who came. Blumenbach is probably the one we still use the most, where you get the American Indian, you get the Caucasian, you get the Ethiopian, you get the Malaysian, and you get the Mongolian. And combinations of those give you your Asians, your whites, your mulattoes, and your blacks, and your various derivations thereof. And whether it's 50 categories or 2 categories, they derive from the plasticity that exists within this kind of way of thinking about difference, a way of categorizing people. But the line for racial the lines for racial classification are always distorted by the ability of individuals to challenge them. And just people in their normal life always do challenge those lines. That is, if you put men and women together and they are of different racial groups, they will have sex with each other. If you tell them they should not have sex, they will definitely have sex with each other. If you tell them don't have sex with the black people, they will have as much sex as they can with the black people. And they will have that sex and they will make babies. And those babies will not fit the category of who they're supposed to be and who the other person is supposed to be. And the very fact that societies make rules for which group they go into, or if they go into a new group, is a reflection itself of how race is socially defined. Because we will make a brown person in Brazil, black in the United States, and colored in South Africa. And it will have nothing to do with that particular individual's characteristics. And it will be all about the social context in which that person exists. The very fact that their racial identity can change by the society that they are in is a reflection of the social fact. Sorry. There you go. So I am arguing that races that resulted from the process that created the 15th century European diaspora are in perpetual conflict. Even if you don't talk to them about their race being important, even if you don't recognize their racial identity as an element in the politics of the society. The reality of the race is something that has occurred on a global scale, and the spectrum in which the various systems have evolved, they evolved within this space where the European diaspora changed the world. So race is a social relationship that can be understood within the concept or within the context of racism. Race is a social relationship that can be understood within the context of racism. There is no other context for understanding race today. It just doesn't work like that. It doesn't work that you just have that beautiful black man who is just beautifully black in his blackness. He doesn't get beautifully black in his blackness by not having something to compare to him. And that beautiful white woman with blue eyes and blonde hair, skin so milky soft, doesn't just get beautiful out of the existence of the milky soft, the blue eyes, or the blonde hair. Her beauty is a result of the social valuation given to those particular characteristics. So her relationship to society is what determines her race and the value of her race. So racial identity is the experience of these shared social relationships. These shared social relationships produce the racial identity that exists. No child is born black, white, brown, or anything else. And they're definitely not born poor. However, society puts them in poverty, or it puts them in a racial category, or it puts them in another social category which becomes the difference, and represents the difference that they have with other people. That's why some people, some places, have a racial identity that they become aware of as they age. And sometimes their racial identity changes. There are many stories in many societies where people talk about the first time they realized that they were black. I mean, there's a man in the United States named Malcolm X who said that he did not recognize his blackness from his other classmates until he was 11. And they told him that niggas can't go off being architects or lawyers, that he ought to be a carpenter, something that he could have realistic expectations. I was speaking to a professor at the University of Buenaventura, which is in Colombia, and she explained to me that she did not recognize that she was black until she went to study in Spain. That in her entire life, up until she was studying for her PhD, was not as a black person, but as a white person. And when she returned to Colombia, she returned as a black person. And so these transformations, I have no problem embracing and accepting, because they reflect the real experience that people live as they confront how societies are racialized. So what is race? I'm giving you what I think race is not. What is it that I think race is? From a scientific point of view, advances in biological anthropology and human genetics symbolize the death of biologically based notions of race. There's a very interesting process. There's a guy in the U.S. who wrote for a newspaper called the New York Times, and he wrote a book talking about how real race was all over the world. And he used a lot of scientific evidence to prove this point. He cited scientists in evolutionary biology. He cited scientists in biological anthropologists, people working, leaders in the Human Genome Project, people working in the Human Genome Difference Project. All of these people, he cited them. And they read the book. The book was a bestseller. People were like, see, we knew race was real. People talking about it ain't real. Genetics is proven it's real. A large group of scientists, who many of whom cited, wrote a response saying we didn't say any of the things that he said. And we object to his use of our work to support his antiquated ideas about race. So in some ways, the science of race is dead. The biological concept of race is in itself unscientific. The next slide, please. So this means that race is not biological, but it does not mean that race is unreal. It does not mean that race is unreal. I know I got a double negative here. That's supposed to be a no-no in English, but maybe it's acceptable in Portuguese, I don't know. But race is not unreal. And in some ways, this suggests a kind of social metaphysics. And I know in philosophy, social metaphysics is not a big thing. But if it was, it would be a big argument in terms of the reality of race having a social ontology versus a natural ontology. Its existence is a result of society. There's a gentleman named Charles W. Mills in the United States. He's a Jamaican philosopher who talks about a mental exercise that we can go through to see just how the social creation of race is important. And he offers this as his mental experiment. Imagine a group of people in Europe go to a place in the Americas, and they find millions of people with civilizations, and they begin to tell a story about the savagery of America. And their interaction with America produces a lot of death. And the death of the people who are in America signals an economic opportunity for these people in Europe. And they seize the opportunity by colonizing America. But they don't have enough labor to fully recognize the potential of America. And in order to supplement their own labor, they begin to recruit involuntary labor in Africa. And they bring those Africans and they work them to death as quickly as they can in order to get as much as they can. As a consequence of that, they create a legacy in which they have to justify both the death of those people in America and the degradation of those people from Africa. And the stories and the narratives they create all justify their acts and suggest that they are still civilized, even though they did these things which might, to the naked eye, without the influence of the story behind it, appear to be uncivilized. So this kind of way of thinking about it, and I offer that to you, he offers it to you as a mental experiment, because you can have many arguments against it. I mean, the very fact that most of Africa, that the idea of the African as a human being is very new. Is very new. The idea of the African as a human being is new. This idea of the African as a human being did not arrive until the middle of the last century. Until the middle of the last century. And it took national liberation movements. It took civil rights movements. It took black power movements in order to demand an acceptance of the humanity of Africans, on one hand as human beings, and the Africans who are the people who are identified as descending from Africa as human beings. So race has a metaphysics, it has an ontology which is based in the experience of creating societies where racial differences are important and justifying that in those societies. And we could compare this social construction, this project of social construction. We could compare how it happened in the United States. We could compare how it happened in South Africa, how it happened in Colombia, how it happened in Brazil. And all of these would give us very detailed, very historically specific, and socially contextualized processes of social construction. The next slide. So race is better considered as a system. Race is better considered as a system, as a structure, as a set of social relationships. Race is better considered as a system, as a structure, as a number of social relationships. And in this context, racial discrimination is a part of race. In this context, racial inequality is a part of race. Racial politics is a part of race. Racial injustice is a part of race. Capitalizing on the notions of the exotic differences in racial culture becomes a part of race. But the most important racial system of the modern times has been white domination. I'm not saying it's the only racial system that has ever existed or the only racial system that is in existence, but it is the most important racial system that exists. The next slide, please. And why do I say that? Because colonial domination is not new. It is not new. But an idea of European colonialism or an idea of white colonial domination is new. It is a racialization of colonization for the purpose of a specific kind of racial articulation. Enslavement has existed on planet Earth for a long time. It still exists on planet Earth. However, racial enslavement is a unique kind of enslavement, where the slaves have to be from Africa and have to be from America, where that kind of system of racial enslavement with a certain group supposed to be in authority, that racial enslavement is specific. And it gave rise to a kind of capitalism that we could even call a white Western capitalism. Some people get away with not calling it this way. There's a guy who's a real famous sociologist named Max Weber. I mean, he writes a book called The Protestant Ethic. In The Protestant Ethic, he's arguing about Western capitalism and how Western capitalism got its origin.
And he talks about why Africa couldn't have it, why China couldn't have it, so that it was something that was specifically Western. But he didn't just mean Western in a geographic sense, he meant Western in a white sense, because he was writing within the context of creating in the social sciences this idea of whiteness and what whiteness means. So that in white capitalist societies, you have those who are first and second class citizens. And for most of the existence of these societies, those in second class statuses have been the subject of much research. It's very difficult to study the first class citizens. They don't subject themselves to the same set of questions. You can't come in there and ask them, why did you have this baby out of wedlock? It's not easy. Or neocolonialism or colonialism and underdeveloped are part of racial systems. So in my work, I argue that these systems have been negative, and they continue to be negative, and that racial systems limit human potential and progress. Racial systems limit human potential and progress. And it's important to note that once I was asked to be a part of a forum. It's called the World Economic Forum. And they asked me, I remember the president of my university, I was getting ready to go to another forum called the Social World Forum, which is, hence the World Economic Forum. And so she said, well, why don't you come and you can argue with the people who got the power. They got the money, they got the governments, they got all this stuff. And I said, yeah, that makes sense. Let me go argue with the people who got the money. And so they made me the chair of a panel on human rights and against every form of oppression that you can think about. And from this experience, I argued with them that we need a new narrative. We need a new thought experiment. And the new thought experiment can go like this. We have not developed to our full potential. Forget about Charles Mills's thought experiment. Look at Tukufu's thought experiment. Tukufu's thought experiment is like this. Imagine that girl who, because she was raised in a society that did not respect her humanity, prevented her from developing her mathematical skills. What equations do we not know? What statistical methods can we not grasp because of this kind of society we live in? Imagine that boy who was born the wrong race in a society which prevented him from truly achieving his individual potential. What have we lost by way of how we do business because of the removal of that individual's contribution? So rather than seeing us having achieved the highest that we can, what if we recognize that we have not begun to recognize what we can achieve until we release the energies of those individuals? That's what I mean when I say the racial systems limit human potential and progress by excluding people in this unscientific, illogical process of differentiating them in a way that prevents them from contributing to society. That's how we got here. So the way to get beyond here is to move beyond the racial limits on human potential and progress. So that racial systems are bigger than our personal experiences and desires. And we all have racial experiences. Some of us because I don't see it. And I've never experienced it in my context where there are people who are being racially marginalized and experiencing race in ways that is removing them from the pool of people who are contributing to society in the best way that they can. So I'm going to stop right here so that we can further talk about these ideas, but that in effect, what I am trying to suggest to you is that race is a problem because it undefines a potential advantage that we have as human beings. And that in societies which are racially stratified or racially conscious, which is most of the world, this is a fundamental problem. And that a solution to the problem is to carefully think through this process of this difference and to put in process programs, social mechanisms that challenge the social systems of race and transform the societies to be better societies for us all. Thank you very much for your patience.